I still remember the sound of my fists hitting that door at midnight. Not because I was angry, because I was desperate. The hallway outside my apartment felt colder than it should have. My phone was dead. My wallet was sitting on the kitchen counter. My keys were hanging on a hook inside my apartment where they were completely useless to me now. And somewhere inside apartment 4B, my golden retriever, Charlie, was probably wondering why I hadn't come back from taking out the trash. I stood there in sweatpants and an old t-shirt, staring at the locked door that had suddenly become a wall between me and everything I owned. The building was quiet. Too quiet. The only person awake might have been my neighbor across the hall. Her name was Rachel, and knocking on her door was the last thing I wanted to do. Not because she was mean, actually. She was one of the kindest people I'd ever met. That was the problem. Kind people make you feel guilty when you need help. Rachel had moved into the building about a year earlier after a painful divorce. Everybody knew pieces of the story. Her husband had left after 18 years of marriage for someone younger. The kind of betrayal that leaves scars no one can see. Since then, she'd mostly kept to herself. She worked remotely, took evening walks, and always smiled politely when we passed each other in the hallway. A few months earlier, Charlie had slipped his leash and run straight toward her. Instead of getting upset, she'd crouched down and hugged him. From that day forward, Charlie adored her, maybe more than he adored me. I stared at her door. Then I knocked. Nothing. I waited. Knocked again. A light appeared under the door. A few seconds later it opened. Rachel stood there wearing pajamas and holding a book. The moment she saw my face, her expression changed. "What's wrong?" I laughed nervously. I locked myself out. For 1 second she stared. Then she burst out laughing. Not a cruel laugh. The kind that happens when life decides to be ridiculous. "Oh, thank goodness." "What?" "I thought someone died." I laughed too. The tension disappeared instantly. "Sorry." "Come inside." "I don't want to bother you." "You knocked on my door at midnight." "We're already past the bothering stage." I followed her into the apartment. The smell of fresh coffee lingered in the air. A movie played quietly on television. Everything felt warm, safe, like the kind of place someone had slowly rebuilt after surviving a storm. Rachel handed me a phone charger. "Use this. You might be saving my life." Let's not get carried away. Within minutes my phone had enough battery to call the emergency locksmith. Then came the bad news. The locksmith couldn't arrive until morning. 6 hours, maybe more. I sighed. Rachel crossed her arms. "So what's your plan?" "I'll sit in the hallway and contemplate my bad decisions." "That's a terrible plan." "It's the only one I've got." "No, it isn't." I looked at her. She pointed toward the couch. "You can stay here." "I can't do that." "Why not?" "Because it's midnight." "And?" "Because we're neighbors." Still not seeing the problem. I hesitated. Rachel softened. "Everybody needs help sometimes, Ben." The way she said it made me realize she wasn't talking about locked doors. Maybe she was talking about herself too. I finally nodded. "Thank you." That night changed everything. Not because something romantic happened. Nothing did. We sat in the living room drinking coffee and talking. Really talking. For the first time, hours passed without either of us noticing. I learned things about Rachel no one else knew. How she'd spent years putting her husband's dreams ahead of her own. How she'd quietly given up opportunities so his career could grow. How she still blamed herself for a marriage she hadn't destroyed. And she learned things about me too. How my father had abandoned our family when I was 12. How I'd spent most of my adult life avoiding serious relationships because I was terrified of becoming him. The conversation felt strangely easy, like we'd both been carrying heavy boxes for years and had finally found someone willing to help carry them. Around 3 in the morning, Rachel disappeared into another room. She returned holding a photo album. "You ever look through old pictures?" she asked. "Sometimes." She sat beside me. The album contained photographs from her marriage, vacations, birthdays, anniversaries, a life that no longer existed. I expected sadness. Instead, she smiled. I couldn't look at these for months. What changed? She thought for a moment. One day I realized those memories weren't ruined. I frowned. My marriage ended. But those moments were still real. I looked at the pictures. A younger Rachel laughing on a beach, holding a birthday cake, dancing at a wedding. She was right. Pain didn't erase joy. The realization hit me harder than I expected, because I'd spent years doing exactly that, letting old wounds rewrite good memories. At some point we both fell asleep. I woke around 7. A blanket covered me. Rachel was asleep in a chair nearby. Sunlight filled the room. For a moment, everything felt peaceful. Then my phone rang. The locksmith. An hour later I was finally back inside my apartment. Problem solved. Or so I thought. 3 weeks later, Rachel's life fell apart again. I came home one evening and found her sitting on the hallway floor, crying. Not quietly, not politely. The kind of crying that comes from somewhere deep. I sat beside her. What happened? She couldn't answer immediately. Finally she whispered, "My mother." My stomach dropped. Rachel's mother lived 3 states away. She'd recently been diagnosed with cancer. Now things had gotten worse, much worse. The doctors weren't optimistic. Rachel buried her face in her hands. I should be there, then go. I can't. Why? She laughed bitterly. Money. It turned out Rachel had exhausted much of her savings during the divorce. Travel costs, medical expenses, legal fees. Life had taken more from her than anyone realized. Without thinking, I said something that surprised even me. "I'll help." She looked up. Number. "Yes, Benny, you're going." She shook her head. "I can't accept that." "Why not?" "Because people don't do things like that." I smiled. "Good people do." Tears filled her eyes again. Not from sadness, from disbelief. The next day I used airline miles I'd been saving for years. Enough for a round-trip ticket. Rachel argued for 20 minutes, then hugged me so hard I could barely breathe. That hug said more than words ever could. She left the following morning. For nearly 3 weeks. During that time we talked constantly. Phone calls, texts, video chats. Some days were hopeful, others weren't. Her mother's condition continued declining. Then came the call, the one everyone fears. Rachel's mother passed away peacefully one evening. I expected Rachel to disappear into grief. Instead, something remarkable happened. At the funeral, she discovered dozens of people whose lives her mother had quietly changed. A struggling single mother whose rent had been paid anonymously. A teenager whose college books had mysteriously appeared every semester. An elderly neighbor who received groceries every week. Acts of kindness no one knew about. Rachel called me afterward, crying again, but differently. She spent her whole life helping people. Sounds like she did. I want to be like her. You already are. Silence. Then I heard her sob. The kind that comes when someone finally believes something good about themselves. When Rachel returned home, she wasn't the same person. She seemed lighter, stronger, as though grief had somehow uncovered purpose. A month later she launched a community support group for divorced women. Nothing fancy, just meetings, coffee, conversation. A place where people didn't have to pretend they were okay. The response was incredible. Women from all over the city began attending. Rachel listened, encouraged, helped. Slowly transforming pain into healing. Watching her was inspiring. But something unexpected happened to me too. The more I saw Rachel helping others, the more I wanted to do the same. We started organizing food drives, helping elderly residents in our neighborhood, walking dogs for people recovering from surgery, delivering meals, running errands. Small things. But small things matter. Sometimes they matter most. Then came Christmas. The first Christmas Rachel would spend without her mother. I worried about her. Everyone did. So I organized something. Nothing complicated. I contacted people whose lives Rachel had touched over the previous year. Women from her support group, neighbors, friends, volunteers. More than 40 people showed up on Christmas Eve at her apartment. When Rachel opened the door, she froze. The hallway was packed. People holding cookies, gifts, cards, flowers. One by one they told her what she'd meant to them. How she'd listened when nobody else would. How she'd helped them survive their darkest moments. how she'd reminded them they weren't alone. Rachel cried through almost every story. So did half the people there, including me. Then an elderly woman stepped forward. She handed Rachel a small envelope. Inside was a handwritten note. Rachel unfolded it carefully. The woman smiled. "Your mother wrote that years ago." Rachel's hands trembled. The note contained a single sentence. Just one. But it changed everything. It read, "The greatest thing we leave behind is the kindness we place inside other people." The hallway became completely silent. Rachel stared at those words. Then she looked around, at all the people gathered there, at all the lives connected by compassion, at all the kindness that had spread from one person to another like light passing through darkness. And suddenly everyone understood. Her mother's legacy hadn't ended. It was standing right there, living, growing, multiplying, through Rachel, through every person she'd helped, through every act of love that continued because someone chose to care. Later that night, after everyone left, Rachel and I sat together in the hallway. The same hallway where I'd once stood locked out and desperate. The same hallway where she'd once cried after learning about her mother's illness. The same hallway where strangers had become family. Rachel leaned her head against my shoulder. "You know," she said softly, "if you hadn't locked yourself out that night, none of this would have happened." I laughed. "You're giving way too much credit to my stupidity." She smiled. That beautiful smile I'd come to treasure. She squeezed my hand. "I'm giving credit to kindness." I looked down the quiet hallway, at the doors hiding hundreds of private struggles, private heartbreaks, private battles, and I realized something. Most people aren't saved by grand gestures. They're saved by open doors, a neighbor who answers a midnight knock, a stranger who listens, a friend who stays, a simple act of kindness offered at exactly the right moment. One open door had changed Rachel's life. It had changed mine too. And every day since, we've tried to keep the door open for someone else.